Good morning, everyone. I'm really, really excited for today's podcast with Crime Victims United. We have an amazing guest. She has spent 31 years as a public servant, as a deputy district attorney, and since 2015, the district attorney of Sacramento County. She's also a personal friend. We've had many talks. She is dedicated to not only to public safety, but to crime victims as well. It has been her passion. I had the blessing of working with her in the DA's office. And I remember when you were in the sexual assault unit, actually, Anne Marie,
Yeah.
and starting the whole DNA, and look what you did with the Golden State Killer. So, ladies and gentlemen, please meet one of, I think, the best prosecutors, best district attorney in the state of California, Anne Marie Schubert.
Thanks, Nina, for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Okay. So, Anne Marie, I wanted to spend some time talking with you today about things that are really impacting victims in our state. But let's start briefly. Why don't you talk a little bit about you? What got you to be a DA? Your passion, I know, in the DNA world in solving crimes. Let's go there first.
That's a good one for me to start off with. I mean, I feel very grateful that I found a profession that I love. So when I went to law school way back in the late 80s, I went for the wrong reasons. I really just went to have a good job. I just thought, okay, I got to have a decent job when I get done with school. And then halfway through law school, I went to school in San Francisco. I interned for this incredible judge named Lucy McCabe in San Francisco, and she was assigned a criminal. I'd never had any exposure to any of this stuff, and I just fell in love with public safety and victims' rights, and I realized then that I had found what I was put on this earth to do in terms of a profession. So when I finished school, and I took the bar, I became a prosecutor in Contra Costa County and spent a couple of years there, went to Solano County. That's where I had my very first DNA case. I was a baby DA, and to some extent, realized then that's what, that DNA was the greatest tool ever. And then I came back to Sacramento. I grew up in Sacramento, came home in 1996, and I've been here ever since. So, like many prosecutors, kind of took your usual course of your path. I did your typical misdemeanors and felonies, but for about 18 years before I got elected, I spent most of my time doing child abuse, sex assault. That's, I think, how we met, Nina, and ultimately homicide and cold cases. So I could talk all day about cold cases, but and there's no question I have a passion for it, but I also feel very, very strongly that DNA has been the greatest tool ever to find the truth, no matter where it is. I mean, people talk a lot about the Golden State Killer, and I'm incredibly proud of that. I also am incredibly proud to have been part of the Ricky Davis case, which was an exoneration of a man who was actually innocent for a crime he did not commit out of El Dorado County. And our lab was able to help not only get him to the quote unquote exoneration in a new trial through DNA, but then to take the next step of using genealogy to determine that, in fact, it was not his DNA, it was nobody related to him, and that he was actually innocent of that crime. So the case is still pending in El Dorado against somebody else now. But I think, if I'm going to put a couple cases at the top of my ladder, there's no question the Golden State Killer is one of them, but Ricky Davis is another one. Because that's really what our job is all about, right? Our job is to find the truth no matter where it leads us.
And I think that is incredible from both perspectives, having been a part with you on the Golden State Killer and seeing justice finally for some of those victims, but then again, justice for a man like Ricky Davis. And I think you're right. That is the job of a prosecutor. I was just going to jump into that. It's not about convictions and notches in your belt. It's about seeking justice, correct?
It's funny. Yes. For about 25 years now, I've had this little thing framed in my office that somebody gave me that says, there's more to being a prosecutor than getting a conviction. And it's a very, very true statement, to kind of go back to Ricky Davis, yes, he was actually innocent, but somebody did kill this innocent victim. And so that's the thing we always have to keep in mind, is that we have to seek the truth, and we have to be willing to go wherever that truth leads us. But there are still victims of violent crime that we have an obligation to seek that truth for.
Yes, very true. Now, I remember when we were in the DA's office, not that long ago, we're not that old, really didn't have any aspirations politically. I don't think when we were doing sex assault cases, I don't even think the conversation ever came up about you being the district attorney of one of the largest counties in California. How did that all come about?
Well, I will say this till the day I leave this earth, as I am not a politician. I am a prosecutor and I'm a public servant. I did not run for DA to be a politician. So what happened, I mean, essentially was, I kind of grew up in the Sacramento DA's office in terms of violent crime. I got involved in some statewide public policy. I was involved in the DA's association in terms of being on the board. I enjoy that kind of stuff. So really, I was very fortunate that when Jan Scully decided to retire, she supported me and encouraged me to do this. I think in large part because I'm very similar to her. I'm a longtime Sacramentan. I grew up here. I'm committed to this community, and I'd like to believe that I have leadership skills that she supported. So, I didn't go into running for DA for any other reason than just to lead the office on good public policy and really move our office forward as a leader, not just in our own community, but across the state. And my philosophy has and always will be, listen, we're always going to be in a courtroom. We always should be. We should always be there for crime victims. When somebody commits a violent crime, I'm very clear to people, if you deserve a trip to prison, you're going. But we also can lead our office in our state in ways to prevent crime as well. And so that's something that I've been particularly proud of, is that, if we can prevent crime on the front end and prevent victimization, we're all going to be better off. We'll be safer, and all, that all should go with the role of a prosecutor, in my opinion.
Absolutely right. If we can prevent victims, and your office has done some pretty innovative prevention things, if you want to speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I did before I was even elected, I was supervising our misdemeanor unit in 2009, I think it was. And historically, we have truancy types of cases. Truancies are when kids are not showing up for school, which can really, anybody that understands the justice system is, if kids are dropping out of school, there's a much more highly likely chance that they're going to end up in the criminal justice system, whether it's as a crime victim or as a suspect. So there's a direct link of kids staying in school and staying out of the justice system. So back when I was doing this misdemeanor stuff, I really pitched a program to Jan Scully, who 100% supported it, which was, let's go out into the community and work with not only our justice partners, public defenders, the courts, probation, but let's also work with the schools to try to intervene in kids' lives long before a truancy action even takes place. So I think it's a great program, a great partnership. We all have different roles in the system, but at the end of the day, we're all better off if we keep those kids in school. Because if you look at the studies, 85% of the prison population tends to be people that either dropped out of school or chronically truant. So that's kind of one example of the things we're doing to try to, working not just with our schools, but other community partners.
That's awesome. And then, just kind of dovetailing back to what your office did with the Golden State Killer. I don't think people realize the lead role Sacramento had in coordinating up and down the state, DNA, genealogy. It was an undertaking, correct?
Well, yes, in a sense. There's no question it's probably the largest prosecution, multi-county prosecution in California history. I'm not sure we'll ever see something like this again, when you have, Sacramento, Ventura, Santa Barbara, Contra Costa, Orange County, Tulare County, so many counties that were touched by this sociopath. So, I guess for me, I was fortunate. I was involved in the case, 20 years ago as kind of a DNA prosecutor. And then when I got elected, I guess you can say I tried to use that position to help bring us all together to really dedicate resources more. I would not say that's what led to the identification and solving of it, but I definitely think the leadership part of it was a very important role. And I'm obviously proud that it was prosecuted in Sacramento, made a lot of sense. And I think it was an extraordinary team across the state, not just investigators, but prosecutors that handled that case with such, I believe, dignity and class and respect for the victims and the process, really.
Yes, and it was amazing. So let's talk a little bit about, I think both of us have been public servants, and
Right.
we've seen the changes in dealing with victims. I think when we both started way back, victims didn't have a lot of rights. I know you
Right.
and I worked very hard on Marcy's Law. to give victims, and I was so proud of California, and as you
Right.
were too, that we became one of the first states with a constitutional amendment. But it seems like some things are swinging differently, and victims are not being heard as much in the system right now. And there's a
I
lot of confusion out there,
definitely
it
think
seems like. So I want to jump into that and talk with you because I think you can explain things that a lot of people can't understand. Like there's a lot of confusion with bail. I
right.
know when I'm talking to people, people just assume bail has no place in our criminal justice system. So what does it matter if we have zero bail or cashless bail? Even though voters voted to keep it, there's still a lot of confusion. So let's talk about that. Where do you see bail fitting in our system? Do you think it's harmful to go to a zero bail system? Can you elaborate?
Well, I mean, there's no question that there's been a movement across this country to reform the bail system. And I think everybody needs to understand that, wherever we land in California, there's going to be some changes. Where what we're seeing in California is going from, we had a bill passed, SB 10 a few years ago that really would have eliminated 100% eliminated cash bail. That then was challenged on Prop 25, and the voters made a pretty overwhelming choice to keep a system in place. And then we've now, I mean, the very people that want to try to get rid of the bail system have just come right back and reintroduced bills, including, the AG that was appointed by Governor Newsom, wants to just, I suppose, ignore the will of the voters. Zero bail, in my opinion, is incredibly dangerous. And we've seen it, what happened was the pandemic hit, and then the Judicial Council, because of concerns about the pandemic spreading within the correctional facilities, adopted a zero bail rule for all the counties. But that was then modified when the numbers started to decline in the correctional facilities. So then it was left to the individual counties because every county has their own bail schedule. So, I would say that if you look at all the counties, while most are fairly consistent, there are some that have continued with, when we say zero bail, it means that people get confused. What does that mean? Does that mean that they don't get out? They do get out? Zero bail means that when you get arrested for something, you're released without any conditions. And so that's what has been the most recent topic because of a recent murder in Land Park. And I, while I can't talk about the specifics of that case, what I can say is that in our county alone, we put out some data a week or so ago because, since zero bail has been implemented, we've had over 5,000 people released on zero bail, meaning that it's a catch and release kind of program.
Right, they're just out.
And they're just out without any conditions. And my whole view on much of these reforms in California is we've had all these things imposed upon us, Prop 47, Prop 57, zero bail, and there's no infrastructure in place to make it successful. So, when Prop 47 passed, which essentially, in my opinion, reduced drugs and theft to basically decriminalizing them, we have really no infrastructure to help people get drug treatment. And that has been, to me, an utter failure. So with zero bail, I'm opposed to zero bail. I think that we need a system that's going to keep the most dangerous people in, and I think there's a place still for bail. I mean, what we're seeing in some other states is they're completely getting rid of it. In California, we're kind of in this quandary right now because, the bill, SB 262 was shelved to be a 2-year bill. So that will be back. And so to me, over the next year in California, there's going to have to be a lot of groundwork done to try to come up with a system that considers the rights of victims, considers public safety, understands that there is an effort to reform the system so that people, listen, we can't incarcerate or detain people because they're poor.
Right.
That is a California Supreme Court decision. We cannot base a decision on bail based on somebody's inability to pay. So there's got to be some kind of system that comes into place that takes all of that into account, but still, protects victims' rights and protects public safety.
Well, and I think you've hit it on the head. Everybody across the country is on this criminal justice reform bandwagon, which I agree. There are things that need to be reformed, but we've it seems like it's so out of balance and we're forgetting about the systems to protect victims. And I think when we talk about zero bail in particular, and I know you can't speak about Ms. Tibbetts' case, but he was a very violent individual that was let out without accountability. There happened to be one in Orange County where a 20-year-old girl lost her life, again on a zero bail. And they forgot the component, I think, for victims where the victim has a right to be heard at a bail hearing. So if we go to a zero bail, then there's no protection for the victims. Their constitutional rights are violated. And the current attorney general, who he is doing everything he can to silence victims, and he and Hertzberg and many of the legislatures, and they constantly turn their back on victims. And
Well, there's
I'm
no
not sure.
question. I mean, I think it's really, really important for the public to understand that victims are being abandoned. There's no doubt about that. When these bills, everybody's caught up in their daily lives, let's be honest, and they're living their lives. And what's happening in our legislature, it's like a super highway of bills floating through that is even difficult for us as prosecutors or as public servants to keep up with because the volume is so high. But when you have, I'll give you an example of a bill that I find despicable that came through this year. It did not make it through, but it tells you kind of the intentions of our legislature. There's a bill this year that said, if you've committed a crime and you've been sentenced to life without parole or capital punishment, so it's going to be a murder with special circumstances. It could be a serial killer, it could be a cop killer, it could be a baby killer. But the judge has said, or a jury has said, here's your sentence. There was a bill this year that said, okay, well, we're going to undo that. And if you've done 20 years, you get to petition to get out again. Now, where
Insane.
we had victims testify on that proceeding, on that bill. They were given a whopping 2 minutes to tell their story of their family member being executed. But how is that fair?
Right.
But that just tells you the mindset. And we essentially, when a victim has the guts to come forward to testify or to give an impact statement, and a judge says, here's your sentence, that's pretty much, there's no assurances anymore.
And that's sad because I still believe, like you, I think our system, our jury systems, compared to the rest of the world, greatest system in the world. And yet, you're right, the legislature, Attorney General Bond, many of the administration, they're doing everything to usurp that system. So, from trying trials as I do, to
Right.
get 12 people to agree to anything, you have to have pretty convincing evidence. I mean, you think about it, if you're married, you
Right.
usually don't even agree with your spouse most of the time. And here comes the legislature that wants to undo what the juries are saying. And you're right, I find that offensive.
Well, it's very, very pro-criminal. Let's just be honest about it. And for me, I'm one of those believers, 100% in rehab, 100%. When if somebody earns a trip to prison and they're going to be getting out someday, whether they're getting out or not, we owe it to that individual to provide the rehabilitation that they need to be successful when they come out. We owe it to them. We want that for the person.
Absolutely.
We want it for society. But what we're seeing now, particularly, and I know we're going to talk about this, but these people are getting out oftentimes, because the law does not define a quote violent crime in the way we think it should be. I just saw a case yesterday, a guy that stalked a woman was sentenced to, I don't remember, 19 years, and he got out in half his time. A very, very serious case. We've seen very serious, serial robbers committing violent crimes, and they're getting out in half their time. So it's very, very concerned. Domestic violence, that's the one I've been complaining about for years.
Right.
Our penal code does not define it as a violent crime. That's a joke. Let's be clear. That is disgusting. And our legislature doesn't want to define it as a violent crime because, goodness sakes, we might actually hold that person accountable and not let them out early as they would otherwise get out.
And you're absolutely right. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Not only are we letting him out, so we're going to jump into that in a sec, we're letting him out with no skills, no tools. So what are they going to do? They're going to go back and commit violent crimes again. And you and I have both seen in domestic violence, those are your most vulnerable of victims usually as well.
Right.
And where do they go? And that's why it's such a high rate of death in those crimes. So talking about releases, which I applaud you, and Crime Victims United was honored to join side by side. We have joined forces, and why don't you explain to people
Right,
about the
right.
early release lawsuit?
So, okay, so to kind of go back in history a little bit, in 2016, Californians, Governor Brown had an initiative, Prop 57, which most folks, um, even if you're in the system, didn't understand how much power that initiative gave to really changing sentencing laws completely. So Prop 57 passed. It was dubbed the, allowing only early releases for nonviolent felons, which we all know is not really nonviolent. So it gave the Department of Corrections tremendous power to basically rewrite sentencing laws. And so in last April, they came out with new regulations that allows for massive credits to 76,000 inmates, enhanced credits, meaning they can get out as early as 50%. And when we found out about this, we found it came out on a Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock. Oh, they're doing this. And within a day or so, we understood the magnitude of this change. And we decided as a group of prosecutors and victims groups that they cheated. They did not do a public hearing process. And it's funny because everybody wants transparency except for when they don't think the public's going to like it. And so we made a decision. I think there's 44, 45 elected district attorneys. That's a huge number, as long with crime victims groups suing corrections. Not so much that I think they don't have the power to impose those regulations. It's the fact that they failed to follow the public notice process, because let's be honest, everybody should have a right to be heard, whether you support the regulations, whether you oppose them. And so that's where we're at right now. And I'm very hopeful that we're going to win this on the merits, and they're going to have to start over, and they're going to have to allow people to give their input on what does this all mean.
Well, and I think too, for people that are listening and joining us, it's important to understand the 76,000 that would receive these credits. These are violent individuals. There's nobody really in our state prisons that are not a violent individual. And you're right.
Either by their past, either by their current crime or their past. I mean, the fact is that we've gone from 170 something thousand inmates in, I think, 2011. We're now somewhere around 90. That's an 80,000 person reduction. So when we talk about who's left, we're talking about murderers, rapists, child molesters, people that with violent histories, and they've now, beaten their wives or their girlfriends. So that you're right. I mean, the people that are kind of left now are, in our opinion, the most dangerous folks. And so if we don't challenge this now, if we don't stand up and say, wait a minute, why can't we be heard? Then what stops them from saying, you know what, we're going to give 90% credits?
Right.
Nothing would stop that, because that proposition gave them so much, at least according to them, so much power to do whatever they want.
And you're right. They're not allowing the victims and public safety to be heard. And I look at the current policies, it correlates to the rise in crime in California. I mean, I listened to the governor say the other day, well, it's across the nation. Well, that's great. But California has a huge rise in violent crime right now. Los Angeles County, I think, is at 110% on homicides. So while I think we all believe in prevention, we all believe in some reform, there has to be a balance, and they're forgetting
100%.
the public safety side. And
Well,
that
I think
lawsuit highlights that.
I think it highlights it. I mean, there's so many things that are going on right now. Listen, I'm not quiet about EDD fraud. I'm very vocal about this massive 30, upwards of potentially 30 will.
That EDD fraud. So,
well, I just think the public needs to know, and I think we need to fix the system, because 30, the reports are upwards of 30 billion. And I don't think there's any coincidence, the fact that law enforcement will tell you that there's massive number of illegal guns on our streets, massive ghost guns running rampant. I don't think there's any coincidence that we're seeing an increase of crime. If we start funding by our own taxpayer dollars people to buy guns, it's a very, very dangerous combination. And I think we're seeing a lot. Yeah, there's some of it, maybe the pandemic, some of it, but I just think that we are in a unique position here in California. Then you've got these policies like Los Angeles, that's just essentially dismantling the justice system.
Let's talk
That
a little bit. Tell me about some of those policies, because as I just said, I know the county's on a rise of 110%, and within the city, it's 93% higher in homicide just in 6 months. So what lends to that in LA County? What's going on?
Well, you have a quote unquote district attorney. I don't even want to call him a colleague, but you have a district attorney who is essentially really ought to just go work in the public defender's office. He's in fact hiring public defenders to come be quote unquote prosecutors, because his whole mission, perhaps funded by his quote base, is to let everybody out no matter what the consequences after a certain period of time. So he adopted, I mean, essentially when he was sworn in December of 2020, the day he was sworn in, he implemented policies, I'm quite confident, written by the very people that are trying to upend this system and, abdicate victims' rights. And many of these policies are just shocking to the fact that the DA's union had to sue him. I mean, when does that ever happen? Let's be clear.
I've never
Across
seen
this
that.
country, when does the DA's union have to sue to get their boss to actually enforce the law? And that happened there. But that's one example. Then you have, like, for instance, probably one of the most devastating to crime victims has been, we're not sending anybody to parole hearings.
Right.
Doesn't matter how dangerous the guy is, doesn't matter if he's raped and murdered people. We're not sending people to parole hearings. And if you listen to his alleged PI media guy, he says, well, the prosecutor's role ends at sentencing. And I'm like, okay, but then why are you writing letters of support, and why are you resentencing everybody 15 years after they've been sentenced? It's hypocrisy at its best. But when we talk about victims' rights, in my opinion, of course we have an obligation to appear at a parole hearing. It may be that we think the guy's done everything he should do. It may be, you know what? He hasn't done what he needs to do and he's still a danger. But why should someone like Jessica Corday have to go to a parole hearing on her own to represent her child's voice, who was murdered, to have to be forced to look at an autopsy report and learn things because the prosecutor has abandoned her? It's honestly, it's disgusting. That's just what it is. It's disgusting. The AG, if you had a real AG, the AG would be stepping in and saying, that's an abuse of discretion, and I'm going to represent Jessica at that next hearing. So, it's very, very disheartening. And you're seeing the movement in Los Angeles amongst many crime victims to throw him out of office.
Oh yeah, let's talk. And you really hit on the parole, and I don't think people quite understand parole hearings. They are devastating for victims. I mean,
Right.
You're having to
Right.
relive a nightmare. And like you said, if the person, maybe they are rehabilitated, but they may not be, and they're very dangerous. And even when you get a district attorney, which I know your county's wonderful working with people, it's still a horrific process. So like Jessica,
Right.
to have to
Right.
read the autopsy photos and basically be her own attorney,
Correct.
you and I both talked with her, how devastating. And she did one of our podcasts. And
Right.
that policy is just disgusting. And I just was talking to another victim in LA. He's now changing the victim witness bureau to a complaining witness bureau. So he's eliminating the word victim even
Yeah.
from his units. And I just, like you said, that's not, it's such, again, I think it's
Silencing.
top down. I think it's
Yeah.
the Attorney General Bonta on down. They are doing everything they can to unbalance the system and silence victims. And I
Right.
just, it's disgusting. I can't
It's
think of any other
disgusting.
word.
I mean, it's honestly, it's part of the reason why I'm running for Attorney General, because we are in a system that has lost its way. We're in chaos. There is no greater example than what's happening with Los Angeles County, San Francisco County, and some of these other counties that are really essentially trying to completely abandon meaningful accountability and victims' rights. That's just what's happened. I mean,
Right.
they don't want to hear from victims anymore. They don't. You look at what Gascon did. He yells at a victim and basically calls her uneducated. Right? I mean, how disgusting. How
Well, look
disgusting.
what
It's just,
Hertzberg did, referring to Miss Tibbetts and calling her an incident, her murder an incident, and she's a human being. It
yeah.
just, it is, it's awful. And I think you just said something really key, which is a message that I hope you take with you throughout your career in running for Attorney General. meaningful accountability. We're not
Correct.
saying lock them up and throw away the key. I don't think any prosecutor ever says that. I don't think most victims say that, but we ask for meaningful accountability and
Right.
for our place in the system. We may not get the sentence we want or do we think the person deserves, but at least if a victim has their rights and their voice heard, I think
Right.
you would agree with me in your career, that makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yes. I mean, we have to be willing to hear both sides and again have meaningful accountability. Now, but trust me, I will say there are some people like the Golden State Killer, lock them up and throw away the key.
Absolutely.
That's a reality of life. But people also we also recognize that overwhelming number of folks that go to prison are coming out. And that's where we have an obligation to balance that accountability with meaningful rehab because we want to make sure, I mean, we have to, in my opinion, let's not forget the facts of a crime. And we can't forget why a judge sentenced him or her to a particular sentence. There's been nothing but complete upending of those various laws. It's not just Prop 47 or Prop 57. It's no more juveniles in adult court. You got to do transfer hearings. You got to do all these things. In LA County, you can be 17 years old and slaughter 12 people at a movie theater, and he's not going to try you in adult court, even though the law provides for that.
Yeah.
Or he's going back on cases that were prosecuted under the last district attorney, Jackie Lacey, where the person was prosecuted as an adult and a jury found him guilty as an adult. And now he's upending that system. Imagine what that's like for those victims' families. It's
Right.
devastating to them. It's not even just ripping off the Band-Aid. It's just re-traumatizing them over and over again.
And again, it's also, I think our legislature's so out of touch because they're, like you said, they're just running these things. I think and people maybe not have understood this, they ran the bill where all misdemeanors are eligible for diversion and they included DUI. And you're sitting there thinking,
Yeah.
so.
Well, I think if you don't live in the trenches, I mean, this is the thing, like, I say about whoever, Bonta, Gascon. I mean, they've never been a prosecutor in a courtroom. Let's be honest. They've never represented a crime victim. They don't know what they don't, I mean, Gascon, yeah, he was a cop for a bit, but he's never been a prosecutor in a courtroom. And so when you start doing these kinds of bills, and clearly they're written by other people that have an outcome, then the real life consequences of crime are being ignored. And so again, to me, it goes back to this balance, which we don't have. Let's be honest, we really don't have it right now. And we don't have meaningful accountability. And really the whole effort right now is to reshape the justice system, let people out of prison, whether it's early, whether it's resentencings. And trust me, we sometimes agree to resentencings. I've had cases myself where I felt, okay, that guy got too much. Let's go back. It was the law, but sometimes, reflecting on the law, sometimes you have an opportunity to do things. But that's where, in my opinion, the state has lost its way.
And the sad thing is innocent people are losing their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I say this and I mean it, there are consequences, not just of crime, but the changes to the system. And are we just willing to ignore those consequences, or are we going to use those terrible situations as an opportunity to say, this is what's messed up about this system. This is, like, for instance, I'll give you an example. And maybe it's SB, but 1391 was a bill that said no 14 or 15-year-olds in adult court. You look at Daniel Marsh from Yolo County, who went out and went on a hunting spree of elderly folks, who was tried as an adult. He's a sociopath. That's what he is. He was tried as an adult. He was convicted as an adult. Fortunately, at least right now, he's going to stay that way. But this is a person, whether he's 15 or 50, that is obsessed with what he did and is very, very dangerous. So, when that whole bill came up, I'm like, there was no safety valve for somebody like Daniel Marsh moving forward. If you have another Daniel Marsh in 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and he kills 12 people and he wants to kill again, is that really somebody that we think can be safely released back into this community, let alone, standing up for the victims of those crimes after he's only been in till he's 25 years old?
And for those that don't know the Daniel Marsh case, do know the victims and sat through all the resentencings with it. That was a horrible. I mean, I think there was 128 stabbings of the two elderly couple by the time he was done, and he placed items in them, and then he kept things as trophies. I mean, it was, my understanding from the hearing, he scored almost as high as you can on the psychosis scale, and yet they were going to release him, but for this one little loophole in the law.
Right,
And that
right.
poor family that had to sit
Yep,
through after hearing
yep.
after hearing. But what I'm hearing you say going forward, because there will be another Daniel Marsh, we don't have that protection anymore. And you're right, it's just so unbalanced.
It's very unbalanced.
Very scary. Well,
Fair.
again, Anne Marie, thank you for your time. I know you're busy.
Yeah.
Thank you for your
Yeah.
dedication to victims, to being a public servant, and you're an amazing human being on top of it. So thank you.
Well, thanks for all the work you guys have done over the years. I mean, there's no question you along with many other victims groups have played such a critical role to making sure that we oppose bad policy and support good policy.
Well, we'll always stay partners, and I applaud you for being one of the people willing to stand up, even with your race for Attorney General, to say we have to bring back meaningful accountability. So thank you for standing tall for victims.
You're welcome.